Hi everybody, John Herzenberg here. We're going to demonstrate in this exercise how to correct this varus distal tibial deformity. I'm sorry we don't have a fibula, but we do have a medial malleolus, and you can see that the joint surface is tilted into about 20 degrees of varus. So this is what we want to correct. We'll do an osteotomy supramalleolar and put on a circular frame and do a gradual correction with some lengthening. Now, you can't help but notice that this bone already has a frame on it. We've previously used this bone to correct a tibia vera problem. It's all corrected. But what I want to demonstrate in this exercise is double stacking of frames. How you can have 3 rings function as 2 totally independent frames. So this frame is independent. We'll add a 3rd ring down here by the ankle, connect it with our struts, and this will be the proximal ring for the distal frame, the distal ring for the distal frame. And this distal ring for the proximal frame is acting as a proximal ring for the distal frame, and it's doing double duty. So the 2 frames are sharing this middle ring. That's a double stacked frame. Because we're double stacking this frame and this has been previously placed, I don't need to put on a proximal ring. All I have to do is put on a distal ring to mimic the varus deformity. Be careful to make sure that the letters A, B, C, D, E, and F are facing downward. And just as reinforcement, the ring says distal side. So this should be facing the distal side of the leg. The other part of the ring says proximal side. That faces the proximal side. So I'll take the A tab and position it front to back, mimicking the deformity, the varus deformity. I'm going to make sure that the wire is the most distal. I'll put the ring above that. I'm going to start by placing a wire from medial to lateral, and I want it to be parallel to the dome of the talus. And it's coming out just anterior to the fibula. I'll then place a second wire, which will be parallel to the medial face of the tibia, starting anterolaterally and exiting posteromedially, but in front of the neurovascular bundle. Now I'm going to place a second wire from anterolateral to posteromedial, and I want to make sure that that wire is exiting just anterior to the neurovascular bundle. I've passed 2 wires, 1 olive from each side, so it prevents the ring from sliding side to side. And we've positioned it so that the A tab and the D tab are front to back. And we've also positioned it so that the ring reflects the varus deformity that's in the distal tibia. So last thing to do is to tension the wires. So I'm going to apply the hand tensioner and pull it down. That holds the wrench. My assistant will hold the ring, and I'll use this tubular wrench to tighten. One more wire. And the last thing, we'll bend these wires to break them flush with the wire fixation bolt. And now we're ready to put on an additional piece of fixation. What about the stability of fixation? With these 2 wires, we really don't control rotation in a front to back angle. Side to side, a little better. So we really need to put an additional bit of fixation front to back here to prevent this toggle. So we have to worry about the tendons, the anterior tendons, anterior tibialis, extensor digitorum. So we'll kind of come anteromedial to avoid the tendons. I've selected a double column cube with a washer or a plate. And I can change the direction according to the anatomic structures. That's a 35. Let's test the stability now. Much better. As I try to bend the ring front to back, is stable. Side to side, stable. And we're mimicking the varus deformity of the distal tibia. Next thing we'll do is put in our struts. So now we have a stable ring. We're going to put in the struts. In a double stack frame, the distal frame mimics the proximal frame. So if this is the 1 and 2 strut coming together on the preference ring, here the 1 and 2 strut come together on the proximal ring. This will be our preference ring for the distal. So number 1, number 2 strut, it's going to totally mimic the frame above. So at this point I've inserted all 6 struts. They're all labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Color coded, and you can see if you compare it to the top frame, the two frames mimic each other. We've got 1 and 2, 1 and 2. They're just double stacked, exactly the same. They share this middle ring as a common ring. This acts as the proximal ring for the distal frame and the distal ring for the proximal frame. I've recorded all the strut sizes. In this case, they're all long. And the A scale and B scale measurements, we've listed the size of the rings. Distal preference ring, because it's closer to the deformity. It's a right leg, and the osteotomy is in the distal metaphysis. So now we're ready to cut the bone. Now it's time to do the osteotomy, so I've disassembled strut number 2 from the distal ring. Bring it out of the way. That makes the frame unstable once we cut the bone, and so we'll be able to see the translation. We'll make a small incision, raise the periosteum, and then make multiple drill holes. And then we'll take our osteotome and complete the osteotomy. So we've made the multiple drill holes, and now it's time to use the osteotome to connect the dots. All it took was one blow, and you can see that the frame with one strut out is completely unstable. We don't want to see it displaced that much in the operating room, but that definitely shows us the osteotomy is complete. So now I'll put the shoulder bolt back in place. And we're ready to go to the computer, get on the website, and do the program to correct the deformity. And there's the non-displaced osteotomy, frame mimicking the varus. No real deformity in the sagittal plane, but maybe we'll program in some rotation just for fun. I've reassembled the number 2 strut and reduced the osteotomy. Now we're ready to close the wound, put on our dressings. Then we're going to put the x-ray marker balls, 3 balls, on the preference ring, take our x-rays, AP, lateral, and then we're ready to go to the computer and do our correction. So we've just put the frame on, and now we're sitting down with the computer and going to run the data so that we can create a schedule for the patient. So we're going to start by creating a new case. The blue button up here in the software tells us what to do. So we're going to call this an SMO, supramalleolar osteotomy. And we can put in other data. We'll put in the date of the surgery, and we're going to put 8/24 as our date. And we'll start the correction a week later on 8/31. About a week latency for a tibial case. We have the option of putting some notes in here, SMO, whatever we want to say, and now we're creating this case. So now we have a new case, and the computer is going to take us to this section, the arrow. We'll hit that arrow and it'll bring us to the actual starting of the case. So we have 6 steps here. We're going to start with step number 1, deformity. I like to start with the bones. We're doing a right tibia, and it's very distal. It's not in the foot, but it's distal tibia. So right distal tibial metaphysis, click on that. And we're going to select a preference segment. Since it's a distal deformity, I like to use a distal preference segment. This follows standard orthopedic nomenclature. And the apex here is varus, so it's apex lateral varus. And on the lateral view, there's essentially no deformity. Now we'll hit save and continue down here in the lower right. And it brings us to the hardware. So now we're on step 2 of 6. We're going to select a full ring for the proximal ring. It's an adult size ring, a large bone, and we used a 155 millimeter ring. Distally, we use the same, a full ring, large bone, and 155 millimeters. Now, what about the struts? we did, on this frame, the lower frame, we used a combination of all long struts, so everything was the same. And we didn't have any non-standard mounts, so we don't need to select that. We'll keep it on the standard outer mount. And now we have to fill in the actual lengths on each of the individual struts, both the A scale and the B scale. So I'm going to take a minute to type these in based on the notations that I made during the surgery. What I find is easiest, I just call these out to the nurse and she writes it down on the chart, and then when I sit down at the computer I can put all this data in. So that's the A scale on the top, B scale on the bottom. The B scale is the fixed scale, the A scale is the adjustable scale. We'll hit save and continue. This is asking us if we want, is it primarily an AP or a lateral deformity? And since this is primarily a varus deformity, there's nothing on the lateral, we're going to hit AP first. And it's going to prioritize the AP x-ray. So this brings up the AP drawing, and I've taken off-site, I've taken an x-ray. We're going to upload that x-ray. I saved it as a JPEG in my computer, so it's SMO AP. And we'll wait a minute while it chugs away and drags this image in. And there it is. So the proximal ring, and remember we stacked frames here, so the proximal ring is part of an upper frame as well, but the proximal ring here is perpendicular to the shaft of the tibia. The distal ring is parallel to the ankle joint. You can see the medial malleolus over here. I'm sorry, there's no fibula on this sawbones. So let's start. The computer wants us first to define the distal ring, and if you look at the drawing here, there's a 1, a 2, and a 3 going from lateral to medial. So it wants us to identify the 3 balls starting lateral, 1, 2, 3. Next thing it wants to define is the proximal bone segment line. So that's easy. It's the mid-diaphyseal line going from top to bottom, and I draw it all the way down so it'll intersect. The next thing it wants us to draw is a distal joint line. Now, we don't really see it on this x-ray, but I know that when I put the ring on, so that it was parallel to the distal joint line. So I think it'd be okay just to draw a distal line parallel to the ring. So we'll start way over here on the lateral edge of the tibia and go all the way to where the medial malleolus starts to come into view, and that's our distal joint line. And let's unzoom now, and we'll go to the next step, step number 4, which is defining the center point of that distal joint line. So we'll zoom it up again and look at that carefully, and we're going to basically put a dot in the center of the joint, right about there. As soon as I do that, the computer will draw a blue line and a black line. The black line is 90 degrees to the joint. The blue line is at a 86 degree or 89 degree angle, representing the lateral distal tibial angle, the LDTA. And that seems like a reasonable number, 89 degrees, although we can change it. We have the option of adjusting it, making it more than 89 or less than 89. But 89 is a population average number, so we can take that. So this gives us an intersection between this red line, which is the proximal tibial diaphysis, and the blue line, which is the joint orientation angle. The intersection is the chora, or apex of the deformity, and then the computer immediately draws the green line, which is a bisector, representing the hinge axis that you would do if you were doing, for example, an Ilizarov correction. You'd put a hinge somewhere on that line. Now, because we're going from varus to valgus, we want to put the actual hinge, and it's asking us to do the proposed pivot point. We're going to put it lateral, somewhere around where the fibula would be. Next, the computer wants us to draw the osteotomy line, and so we can zoom up to see our osteotomy. We're going from point 1 to point 2, lateral to medial. So we'll put a dot on point 1 on the lateral side, another one on the medial cortex where the osteotomy is. And now the next question the computer is asking us, number 6, is to propose a pivot point. So somewhere on that green line we want to put a chora, or a rotation point, and the axis of correction of angulation, and ACA. And so I like to do it on the fibula or just lateral to the fibula. And if I don't like that, I can go back a step and move it a little bit more lateral so we get more length. This way we're sure the fibula is not going to be impeding our distraction. Last thing is to hit the RDP points, the rate determining points. That's for this, we want to go on the concave side and hit the medial cortex of the bone. We do the same for the soft tissue, or we could put the posterior tibial nerve, but the computer will choose whichever point is further away from the bone, so make your RDP bony and soft different. We'll go to the next screen, and the next screen is the importation of the lateral x-ray. So we're going to go back and find this in our file. And so here's our lateral x-ray. It's set up like you would put a right lateral tibia with the anterior surface to the left and the posterior surface to the right. So now we've loaded the lateral x-ray, and we're going to define the distal ring from point 1 to point 2 to point 3, going from anterior to posterior. So identify the ring, the balls, ball 1, ball 2, and ball 3. The next thing, computer asks us to draw the proximal segment line. That's the mid-diaphyseal line going from proximal to distal, from 1 to 2. And the next thing it wants us to draw is a distal joint line. Since there's no deformity on the sagittal view, we know that from our pre-op x-ray, we're going to draw that as about a 10-degree line tilted from anterior to posterior. Then the computer will want us to identify the center point of that distal ring, which is basically the center of the ankle joint. As soon as we draw that, the computer generates two more lines, a black line and a blue line. The black line is 90 degrees to the ankle joint line, and the blue line is set at 80 degrees, so indicating the 10-degree tilt that the joint normally has. And as you can see, we can adjust that so until the blue line and the red line superimpose, which is really no deformity. Or here it's maybe 1 degree. So there's essentially no deformity in the sagittal view. Next question the computer asks us is, where is the osteotomy? So we're going to draw a line from anterior to posterior, dot 1 anterior, dot 2 posterior. That defines the osteotomy. After we go to the next step, the computer wants a proposed pivot point. Now, you notice that the computer automatically drew a yellow line, which is the transverse bisector based on the AP view, which is the dominant deformity for this. So where do we want this? It may get a little bit of procurvatum, so I might put the proposed pivot point in the front, although the truth is that there's no deformity, so it really doesn't matter where we put it. So the next thing the computer is going to ask us is to apply a rate determining point for both bone and soft tissue. And here I would go, we may get a little bit of procurvatum, so we'll go posterior. Although chances are we're not going to need that. Same thing with the soft tissue. And this is our final review. We can go to the next section, which is section number 5 out of 6 sections. And this is the fun part. This shows you what your deformities are. Based on the lines that we drew, the computer has calculated we're going almost 20 degrees, 19.9 degrees. I like round numbers, so let's change that just for fun to 20. And procurvatum to recurvatum, we can change that to 1 to induce a little bit of procurvatum, since you tend to get some procurvatum deformity. And then the translations on the AP view are 4.5 millimeters because the apex of the deformity is a little bit below where our osteotomy is. So we will see some obligate translation. And finally, the amount of lengthening that we'll see based on where we chose the axis of correction is going to be 11.4 millimeters of lengthening. The default for the rate of correction, both bony and soft tissue, is 1 millimeter per day. And based on this, it'll take 20 days. We have the option of making changes. We could divide this into steps, or we could say, you know what, there's actually some rotation that we missed on the x-ray, and let's say it's internally rotated. We want to correct some of that, so let's say 10 degrees of rotation. That's something you can't measure from an x-ray, that's a clinical measurement. And if I want to change it up so the rotation occurs last, I can induce some steps by making the initial correction of rotation 0. That'll automatically give me a step 2 where 10 degrees of rotation occurs. So what we've told the computer now is to first do 20 degrees of angular correction, 11.4 millimeters of lengthening, and then once that's completed, then we want you to do 10 degrees of rotational correction from internal to external. The total number of days it's going to take to do this is going to be 20 for the initial step and 5 for the rotational step. First the angular correction, and then the rotation. Okay, so here we are. We're at the last step. This is the schedule. This is what we'll give the patient. We've already put in the date of surgery and the start date a week later. And the amount of adjustments per day, I like to do at least 3 per day, so we'll put it at 3. And the computer has calculated it's going to take us a total of 25 days to get the correction. So the good news here, as I look at this, there's no strut changes, so we don't have to worry about that. This is the numerical schedule where the patient needs to be every night before they go to bed. They can check the schedule to make sure at the right numbers. This is the millimeter schedule. We can also give the patient a click schedule. This is what they have to have in order to make those daily minute adjustments 3 times a day. If it's a negative number, they have to turn counterclockwise. If it's a positive number, they have to turn clockwise. So this tells them the number of clicks and the millimeters. We can give a header for this, so when we print it out, the patient can see something like SMO schedule. That will print out on our printout, and then we hit these bottom buttons. We'll bring up a PDF of what this is, what the patient will actually look at. They'll get a schedule that looks something like this. We can send them a PDF, we can print it out and give it to them. And I urge the patients to take a picture of this with their cell phone so that if they ever lose it, they've got a copy of it permanently in their cell phone. And every night before they go to bed, I ask them to look at the numbers to make sure that's where they are. Now if we go back to the click schedule, this is what a printout, a PDF would look like that we give to the patient, and it's written by days, morning, midday, and evening. We chose 3 adjustments per day. If we had chosen 4 adjustments a day, we would have seen a total of 4 on each day. And there you have it. That is our creation of a schedule for this supramalleolar osteotomy. We can now go back to the lab and apply this and see what our correction looks like. Now we've completed the gradual correction, and you notice that we've got about 1 centimeter of length achieved. Because our osteotomy is above the apex of the deformity, we have some obligate translation, and the joint now is perpendicular to the shaft. And the shaft is centered over the center of the ankle joint. 10-degree tilt of the ankle joint. So this is a double stacked frame where we corrected varus, tibia vera at the proximal end, tibia vera at the distal end. Notice how the 1 and 2 struts play out. The 1 and 2 struts play out. The center ring is shared by the distal frame and the proximal frame.